classic kind of scary story is you take the audience from a safe space, you lead them into the woods, you take them to the darkest corner of the woods. You scare the hell out of them, and then you lead them back out to safety again. And I like the films that take you into the darkest corner of the woods and then just leave people there. Just leaves them in the darkest corner of the woods to find their own way out. And then the film plays on. You're forever trying to work out what it meant. The starting point really was to get a film made, to get a follow-up to Bait out as quickly as possible.
Losing your temper isn't going to help.
I haven't lost my temper yet.
We'd finished Bait, which was my previous film, so I felt a bit of pressure over what I was going to do next, and I decided to do the same again really, to shoot something that was contained, small cast, small number of locations, a simple story, but a genre story. When I wasn't working in horror, people were saying this feels like a horror film, and the way I shoot, I think it has that sense of foreboding within it. It got me intrigued. If formally my films are feeling like a horror film, how about actually getting a script that's a horror film and then shooting it in that same way? For me, personally, the way I work, I love limitation. If I haven't got limitations, then I don't do anything. My best ideas don't come from within my imagination. They come from looking at what we can't do and working out what we can do. The film's set in 1973 on pretty much an uninhabited island off the coast of Cornwall. So in reality, there is no island. The island you see in the wide shot is off the coast of Wales. Everything else is a composite built of fragments of our kind of backyard, really, where we live, the very far western tip of Cornwall.
The volunteer is a woman on her own. Because of the fact that she's isolated on the island, she sets up her routine. It's basically her journey of that sort of discovery of the island, the world around her, and the battle of her trying to make sense of everything.
She's volunteered to be the person who's going to be alone on this island, documenting what happens to these rare flowers that are growing on the cliff. There's not a lot of backstory that comes with her character. For me, it was always allowing the audience to project onto that character who they think she is and what she represents. Lovely. We'll go again. More smoke this time. Let's go. Let's lift it right up.
I'd say to Mark sometimes during the process, shouldn't I be reacting more? Shouldn't there be more of a, don't I need to show utter terror in my face? He said, I don't ever want her to look like a kind of a victim, a woman on her own, standing there screaming. She's not this weak person who's just being pursued all the time.
I give the actors very little to work with other than the script, and then they bring themselves to it, so the characters become 50% them and 50% me. They can ask me questions, and I may or may not answer them.
And then often when I did ask him questions, he'd go, I'm not going to tell you. What do you think? So that was always really tricky. As an actor, I like to be told what to do, and he's often trying to draw the performance from me. So sometimes he would say, I don't know. I do know, or I'm not going to tell you, or you work that one out for yourself.
If I think they need an answer, then I'll give them an answer, but quite often I'll want them to be kind of confused about what they are and where they're going, because I think that's pretty much the human condition. I work with a Bolex 16mm clockwork camera, which shoots silently. You know, it's not a sync camera, so I don't record any location sound. The camera only runs for 27 seconds, so that dictates shot length. Camera movement is always very limited and used very selectively, because I can do 3 things with the camera. I can focus pull, I can move the camera, and I run the shutter. And I've only got 2 hands, and I always have to be running the shutter, so I can either pull focus or I can move the camera. If we were going to do colour, we were going to do loads of fucking colour. That was the mantra. A lot of people know me for shooting black and white, but with this film, I knew it needed to be colour because thematically it's about the flora and fauna within the island, and certain colours are really key to telling the narrative. Specifically the red that you get in film, I think it's a different red that you get when you're shooting digitally. I wanted that red that I'd seen in the films that I was obsessed with growing up, which was 1970s cinema, really. I was worried that I was going to get an egg back from the lab and it would be too good. And so what I did was shot with a 1970s zoom lens, which would have been the lens that 1970s horrors that I was into would have been shot with, which has idiosyncrasies. So that was kind of taking care of the in-camera kind of inconsistencies, but I also wanted to play with the negative a little bit. So underexposing everything by a couple of stops, having it processed as if it was correctly exposed, and then getting quite a thin negative back, which then in the retiming in the color grade, I could really push. So the more I saturated it, the more it kind of fell to pieces. And I went too far with some of it. There's a couple of shots where the grain almost becomes a character. Sound is 50% of any film, but I think when you're working in the way that I work, it's more than 50%. It's the most exciting bit of the process for me, I think. The sound is where it's at with this film. It makes sense of the whole thing. Picture goes one way and the sound goes the other way, it's where cinema becomes transcendent. Something that feels real and then it becomes abstracted is where cinema comes alive. I've re-recorded all the dialogue.
Please don't climb up there. I don't want to keep telling you, but I have to.
There's this sense of foreboding, this kind of disconnect between sound and picture. Because of the way I work with a picture cut that's got no sound, so I'm adding Foley straight away. As soon as I'm cutting scenes together, I'm putting Foley in, I'm putting Atmos beds in, and I'm also working on the score, all at the same time when it comes to the sound. But then I do work with a dubbing mixer and a Foley artist who replaces quite a lot of my Foley, because I would just do the Foley stood at my bench while I'm editing. You know, I've got Foley traps that I've got a piece, like for ENYS Main, I built a piece of wooden floor that I stood on while I was editing. So as I was cutting the picture, I had a microphone on this fake bit of floor so I could do all of Mary's footsteps and all this kind of stuff. But a lot of that gets refined because it's quite rough around the edges the way I work. If I can't record it realistically in the studio, then I'll create an abstract sound to replace the realism that I can't achieve. And then later on people will go, oh, it's amazing, you put that sound effect in and it means this. And I think, no, I put it in there because I couldn't get a realistic sound of that in my studio. So there's a scene where a gannet is flying and dives into the sea. So I was trying to get the sound of a bird breaking the surface of the water, and I was trying to replicate that in the studio. And it just all sounded lame. I had a sound effect that I'd recorded as some smashing glass from later in the film. I thought, what about the bird that hits the surface of the water and you hear the sound of breaking glass, and it's a sonic call forward for later in the film. And for me, that's one of my favourite moments, and people really pick up on it. It's the point of the film where reality's starting to break down.
ENYS Main explores time, nature, grief,
Who's there?
and what happens when time goes really weird.
The theme of the film for me is about memory. It's about the natural world and the paradox of how fragile the natural world is and how one little action can set a chain reaction. But also, paradoxically, how robust the planet is and how robust the natural world is. And the volunteer, during her time on the island, begins to discover just below the surface what humans have done, what they've built, what they've taken out of the earth, what they've lost to the sea. But very quickly it gets forgotten. So that's the paradox, you know, it's all very fragile, but it's not as fragile and transient as human existence is.
Let the lower lights be burning, send a gleam across the wave. Some poor fainting, struggling seaman, you may rescue, you may save.
The thing I fear most is the breakdown of time. Films that mess around with time logic have always just fascinated me. What happens if tomorrow isn't another day? What happens if tomorrow is the same day? That's true horror for me, when time doesn't make sense, because there's nothing to cling on to anymore. The fact that each day is 24 hours long is very comforting. If that disappears, then who are we? What are we? What comes next?
Fuck! Fuck!